Thanks so much. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Want to welcome everybody to the November Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board meeting. We are now entering the comment period and see if we have any comments from our Deputy Designated Federal Officer, EPA, and TDEC liaisons. So we'll go ahead and start with you, Jay. How are you?
I'm doing well this evening. How are y'all? So tonight, we've got a couple of our federal portfolio project directors here, Brian Henry and Bill McMillan, who are going to talk a little bit about our excess facilities at Y12 and RNL and the efforts that we're going after over there. We were blessed enough in this past cycle to get some plus-ups in our budget that allowed us to start some important stabilization and risk reduction work over there in these facilities. And hopefully in the next budget cycle, there will also be some additional funding there. The funding, the reason I refer to it as additional funding, it's a plus-up that comes with congressional restrictions on it that it can only be used for those facilities. One of the reasons for that you'll hear about tonight is the GAO and IG both had a couple of reports about 2 or 3 years ago that talked about the problem with excess facilities within the department. And long story short, the majority of the really bad facilities are actually here in Oak Ridge. We have about half of the worst in the complex. So it's been very important for us as part of our plan to eventually move from ETTP over to RNL and Y12 to do the work to start getting those facilities stabilized and do some risk reduction means as we get them ready for D&D. So hopefully you'll hear about that a little bit tonight. Some of it may be a little counterintuitive because we're roofing buildings. In some cases we'll be tearing down. But one of the lessons learned, I think I talked about it a month or so ago when I came, one of the lessons learned we've had from EM is you need to keep the building shell as intact as you can, because once you let rainwater get in, then you really have degradation to the facility structures. And that's when facilities get unsafe to be in. It's also when stuff starts getting out of facilities.
Okay, and Krzysztof Sartowski from TDEC. You, sir.
Good evening to everyone. State of Tennessee fully supports risk reduction, including removal of the excess contaminated facilities on the Oak Ridge Reservation. So we're going to extend all support and work together with DOE and EPA to achieve these ends.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a public comment period, and Gabrielle, if you wouldn't mind. Use your microphone, please. That'd be great. Thank you.
The public comment period is now open. Are there any members of the public who want to comment? As a Citizens Advisory Board to the Department of Energy on environmental cleanup, we want to encourage the community at large to attend and participate in our board and committee meetings. If you are unable to attend, please send in your questions and comments to the address shown. Appropriate comments and questions will be read during the public comment section of the Site-Specific Advisory Board meeting and will be given the same consideration by the Board and Department of Energy as those given in person.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we're going to now move on to our presentation, get moving right along here.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm Bill McMillan, and I've got the ORNL portion of the talk, but I've also got a little background information for you that I'll go through. But as Jay mentioned, Brian and I are glad to be here tonight to talk to you about some of the work we're doing to reduce the risk in some of our excess facilities. The risks are associated with continuing degradation of those facilities and represent, as you'll see, risk to our workers, risk to public safety and environment potentially. And it makes our work more difficult in the future if we don't address some of the risks that we're seeing today. And so hopefully we'll share enough background and information on this to give you a good view of what activities are going on today that we're addressing with the plus-up money that Congress gave us. Next slide. Many of you may have seen this, but for some of the newer folks, I thought we'd kind of show this in terms of a background of the reservation. we have basically 3 sites, major sites on the reservation. They're all operated by different programs within DOE. The East Tennessee Technology Park is primarily an EM site. Its primary emphasis for cleanup there is a reindustrialization initiative to get ourselves off that site and clean it up for future industrial reuse. Y-12 is a National Nuclear Security Administration site, has a definite defense mission, and ORNL is an Office of Science site that has research and missions in energy and isotopic research activities for the most part. EM has missions at all 3 of those sites. Obviously, the ETTP is the one that we are most actively engaged in D&D activities at this time to support the reindustrialization effort. And I'm sure you've heard of Vision 2020 and seen a lot in the news lately about some of the accomplishments we've had at that site, taking down some of the old facilities there and building a historic preservation aspect to preserve the history on that site. Y-12 is next in priority. It's because of the reindustrialization effort and the funds that EM continues to spend there until our job is done, we consider that more of a life cycle risk to our program to enable us to get done with that site so we can free up the funds that we're spending there and apply it to other cleanup at the other 2 sites. Y-12, we have mainly an environmental risk that's being addressed by the cleanup there. You all know about the mercury that leaves the site in the East Fork Poplar Creek runoff. We're addressing the mercury issues, and Brian manages that work. At ORNL, it's primarily due to the past operations and the unique radioactive materials that were used there in developing the isotopes program. There's a radiological risk that's holed up in the excess facilities there that the cleanup program will have to focus a lot of intensity on dealing with that. And in the middle of all the cleanup, we're kind of a unique site compared to some of our western friends where we have a lot of rainfall, 58 inches of annual rainfall that contributes to shallow groundwaters and a lot of surface waters in the area. And we're in a fairly densely populated population area where some of our western sites are out in the boonies away from everything where they don't have the population risks to deal with in their cleanup program. So we're a little bit unique in some of the programs and the risks that we have to address here in Oak Ridge. So as you know, most of the facilities that were built in the complex were built back in the 1940 to 1960 timeframe. So they're about 75 years old, many of them. And that's pretty consistent across the complex. A lot of the complex facilities, across the nation were built in that same time frame as a result of the wars and World War II and so forth. What's brought our attention to the excess facilities was focused by the GAO and Inspector General audits that were conducted in the 2015 timeframe. The audit reports were issued. They identified a lot of high-risk facilities that are just being maintained and not being done anything with, that are in deteriorating conditions. And even, as Jay mentioned, some of the worst are here in Oak Ridge. They specifically called out Alpha 5 at Y-12 that Brian can maybe talk about a little bit as the top of the list in terms of the worst of the worst. So in response to the audits, the Secretary of Energy chartered an excess facilities working group. That working group was assigned and made up of science, NNSA, EM, all the programs that have responsibilities and ownership of some of the facilities across the complex to take a look at the facilities and to prioritize the risks that are posed by them. That working group worked over the next several months, probably 9 to 12 months, to develop a prioritized list of the sites and develop a draft report that is going through concurrence now through the various agencies before it gets to Congress. So that report's been developed and is in concurrence and pretty close to being finalized. we were in a pretty good situation here in Oak Ridge to be able to respond to the data call that the working group put out. We had the advantage in 2007, Oak Ridge Environmental Management started trying to get their arms wrapped around what is the entire scope of cleanup, including what we expected to get in the way of facilities from the operating programs at the other sites at Y12 and ORNL. And so the Integrated Facilities Disposition Program, we call it IFDP, it's easier to say, less than a mouthful. IFDP was developed, and it was essentially a chartered project to develop the entire cleanup scope in a holistic approach for EM. We partnered with ORNL and Y12, as I mentioned, to develop that program. Once the facilities were identified, there were a lot of walkthroughs done and research on the operations in those facilities to give us a good level of knowledge on what the cleanup approach and the scope and the hazards in those facilities would be encountered. IFDP in our project management space received what we call a Critical Decision 1 in 2008. Critical Decision 1 is basically a maturity level that allows us to conceptually say, here's what we think the scope, cost, and schedule of this work will be. And in 2008, we estimated a $9 to $14 billion cost range and 25-year duration to accomplish that cleanup. But that program and work gave us the mature understanding of our projects and our excess facilities and the missions that would have to be done there in order to be able to respond to the data call. At the same time, or roughly about the same time, more recently than the IFDP work, see, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. I didn't flip the slide. This was throwing me off. At the same time, about 2015, about the same time as the GAO and the IG were developing their reports, we were beginning to realize too that it seemed like we were having a lot more maintenance issues popping up in a lot of our excess facilities in our operations because of the age of these facilities and some of the maintenance that was not being done and so forth. And as well as, I think, things across the complex that started getting realized, like the WIP issues that they had out at the waste isolation pilot plant that drew attention, that caused us to really start looking at ourselves in terms of what do we need to do to further the surveillance and maintenance of these facilities so that we can make sure they remain stable for a longer period before we can actually get into D&D. As you know, since today, in 2007, when the IFDP was done, we thought the program to start demolishing some of these facilities were pretty much imminent, but as today we're 10 years down the road and we still know that it's out in the mid-2020s before we get into a real cleanup scope at Y12 and ORNL, much later than IFDP anticipated. So we assembled an integrated project team with UCOR. We called it our S&M integrated project team. And that team actually did some risk reviews in all the facilities and that are being maintained and identified a list of activities that we also used in responding to the excess working group data call. And so between IFDP and the integrated project team approach to looking at the S&M work, we had a pretty good idea and ability to do this prioritization to identify the highest priorities for potential funding if Congress plussed us up with any money. So 2016 comes around and Congress awards us the money that Jay was talking about, the $28 million to begin work on doing some things. As Jay mentioned, it was earmarked towards addressing the risk in these facilities, to abate hazards and stabilize them, reducing the near-term risk. And we're going to talk about some of those things that we put the first application of funds against at both ORNL and Y12, and we'll talk about each one of these individually. In addition, the molten salt reactor experiment at ORNL is another important facility that's that's got a lot of maintenance activities associated with it that are pretty high hazard. We wanted to get our arms wrapped around what those hazards are and some of the things that could be done there for future funding, specifically FY17 and out. And so we took it on ourselves to charter an engineering evaluation of those risks, and we are just receiving the report from UCOR and starting to review that. And so all that was done with some of the excess facility dollars we got. This is an aerial photograph of ORSSAB, and no, the buildings aren't all red like they're shown here, but the red colored buildings are excess, and in the some of them are in the EM program, some of them are still in the Office of Science program at the lab. But some of the facilities I'll talk about, and if you do the tour a little later this month that we're trying to set up, the work I'll talk about, 3026, is the building pad that is right here. It's an empty pad. 3038 is this red brick. It's red in this picture, but that building right there is building 3038. And 3028 and 29 are a couple of the isotope row facilities. They're located right in this area. I'll also talk about building 7500, which is off in the other valley, up in Melton Valley over here, and I've got some photos of that. Okay, so I'll talk 7500 first. This is the old homogeneous reactor experiment that was built in the 1950s, 1951 to be exact. It was operated in the early 50s all the way up to the early 1980s. It had various missions in reactor experiments, chemical processing, and research. It's a pretty large building, 14,000 square feet, on 3 levels. It was shut down in the 80s, and various remedial actions were completed to take down some of the accessory buildings around it, and there was a pond in the back that was remediated back in the 90s. Today's risk reduction scope is focused on combustibles, asbestos, and water. The building has, as I'll talk about, the basement in this building is flooded. I've got some photos of that, which creates a high humidity factor inside the building. There's a lot of asbestos containing material in the building that was used as fire retardant today that represents a respiratory hazard to the workers. Combustibles in the building that are still there, and removal of those eliminates a fire hazard. So we'll talk about those. I've got some, it's kind of a picture show now. First activity we've actually funded in 16 was the removal of the combustible materials. So you can see some photos here of those types of materials that were being wrapped up and sealed and disposed of. This removes the fire hazard risk. Once the combustible materials were removed, it allowed us to go ahead and decommission or deactivate the heat detection system in there. It's a fire protection maintenance activity. Combustible materials are removed, it lessens our fire hazards down below levels that we would need to have an active system. And it's part of the process of going cold and dark. This shows some of the asbestos. You can see where it's kind of fallen off and represents a real, it's friable situation that's a hazard to the workers. You notice the worker in the previous picture had to have respiratory protection on and fully enclosed suits to do work in there. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to get this work done, is because it does inhibit our ability to go in and do the inspections and things that we need to do in that building. And then I mentioned the water in the basement. This is one of the shots of a photo of one of the access ways into the lower basement. Excess moisture, we're planning to pump that out, try to do some sealing in that basement to keep the water from coming back in, and then seeing what we can do in terms of stabilizing that situation. So today, what we've done and so far, we funded the combustible removal work and the deactivation of the heat detection system. Additional funding in 17, if we get it, will be applied towards the asbestos and the water removal. We had to do those things in sequence, obviously. You can't go do the asbestos with all the combustible materials in the way. So we've kind of cleaned out the facility now and are ready to go forward with the asbestos and water work. Building 3038, another pointed it on the map. It's a former isotope laboratory that was used for some research and shipping and production. Constructed in 49, 7,000 square feet. There was some Recovery Act and Recovery Act work in 2009-10 timeframe that was done to try to remove a lot of the legacy materials in that building. It did leave, though, some glove boxes and some radioactive isotopes in place. It caused it to remain a Category 3 nuclear facility, and the work today is focused on reducing that contamination levels in there to allow us to downgrade that facility to a radiological facility instead. That simplifies a lot of our ongoing S&M actions, surveillance and maintenance actions in that building if we don't have to dress out to the levels that you have to for a nuclear Category 3 facility. So the work is focused on working on the stabilization of the contamination in some of the glove boxes in that building. There's a HEPA filter housing on the roof that was shut down years ago, but the HEPA filters and the contamination levels in that housing are still there, which contributes to the radionuclide inventory. And as I mentioned, the goal is to get the hazards down below nuclear standards. So here's a shot of some of the glove boxes. There's some loose contamination in there, so we want to stabilize that through fixing them. We also, if there's funding available, we'll just remove those glove boxes and put them into the waste inventory for disposition. This is a shot of the filter housing on the roof. The white spray paint was some of the fixatives put on there for any residual contamination on the outside, but they are internally contaminated. We want to deal with this filter housing and take it down and dispose of it. This shows some of the workers in there doing some characterization activities on the glove boxes. We found some data that kind of indicates that there may be more inventory in that building than we originally thought. So we're now going through a full characterization of the contents of the building to get better inventory information on what kind of contamination levels we have. And based on the results of that, we'll determine if we have the ability to make the radiological goal that I was mentioning. That'll kind of dictate whether or not we continue with the glove box removal or those things. So TBD at this time. But we are developing the plans for the removal of the HEPA unit and stabilizing those glove boxes for removal. 3026 was the concrete pad I pointed to in the picture. This is a building that was a hot cell facility that was used in isotope production back in the 40s and 50s. Previous remedial actions removed the wooden building structure that were around these hot cells, and what you see left in this photo are the east bank of hot cells that were encapsulated when the building was removed. So these two structures remain, as well as to the left of this, and I got some pictures on the next slide or two of some of the foundations for some of the west bank hot cells that we've done some work with as well. So the scope here was to remove the wind enclosure on the top. Basically the hot cell structure still has the removable hot cell plugs in the top of it. Water was leaking in through those roof structures, those plugs. And so one of the goals was to remove that wind enclosure and seal that roof with a new roof to preclude water from coming down into the hot cell. There's also a tunnel that connects this bank of hot cells with this hot cell, and that tunnel has water in it. We believe the water probably originated through the in leakage from the roof panels. So One of the things we're doing is pumping the water out of that tunnel. It's basically a pass-through tunnel. We're pumping the water out of it, and then we've taken some characterization samples of the tunnel to make sure we understand what the radionuclide content of any residuals left in there along the walls or the floor of that tunnel. And then we're observing it right now to see if water is infiltrating back into it, and that'll kind of help us determine what next steps we need to take with the tunnel. The stabilization of the concrete pads is the pedestal. We call them pedestals. That was the West Bank pedestals. I think it's the next slide that'll have the pictures of those. So this is the removal of the wind enclosure, some shots that were taken then. You can see the panels coming down, and the structure coming down around it. And I don't know if you can see the new white roof that's on the top of that. That job's been completed. These are the pedestals built. Basically, they were kind of ragged, chiseled out concrete when you looked at them before the coating and sealant was put on them. So we built forms around them and poured concrete over the forms to contain any kind of loose contamination that could come from those pedestals and run off with rainfall from the pad. And then this is a shot of one of the entryways into the tunnel that connects those East Bank hot cells I was talking about. And it's probably kind of hard to tell in the shot, but that greenish looking is the water that's in there. So currently we've removed and put the roof cover on. We've coated the pedestals, we've drained the water, and now we are getting the sample results and kind of observing the tunnel for future in leakage and see how that goes. 30, 28, and 29 is there are two isotope, we call it isotope row, but they're back in that isotope area behind building 3038 in that same area. They operated from the 50s to the 80s. They were hot cell facilities that were used in production and research. Materials were de-inventoried back in the 90s, so what's remaining now are the hot cells in there, and there's still loose contamination within these hot cells. And from a worker safety standpoint, we'd like to do some simple fogging in those hot cells to fix contamination so that future remedial actions in those is much less risky and easier to perform. So I think this scope includes removal of these manipulator arms. We'll use the manipulator, the holes through the wall where the manipulator goes through to allow us to do that fogging work in those. Okay, so I think Ashley said that we want to ask questions before I leave and Brian gets up so we don't have to pass the mic. So if any questions on the O&L piece of it.
Okay. We'll start with the gentleman to my right, Dave.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. McMillan, on building 3026, the hot cells encased in concrete are planned to be disposed of, torn down, and removed.
Yes.
What about those concrete pads that were poured over on the west portals?
The west hot cell bank, they will be chipped out and removed as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the pad removed as well.
Okay. Thank you. Dennis?
Thank you.
You're
The
welcome.
basement of Building 7500, you mentioned the level of water that you have in there. Is that just runoff from the local drainage there, or is it contaminated water?
We've got samples that we'll collect on the water to confirm the contamination levels in them. We believe it's relatively clean groundwater that's basically seeped through the foundation of the building.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Chris?
I just had a question about prioritization of the excess facilities.
Chris, can you get closer to the microphone if you don't mind?
Yes, just,
There you go.
when
Cool.
it came to the prioritization of the excess facility, what were some of the primary factors that you guys used?
Criteria
to prioritize them, and how did those things rate against, community impact?
Well, what we did was is relatively a subjective type of analysis, given the time that we had. But we looked at the facilities and the hazards in them with relation to Are they an impact to the worker and not to an off-site release type of situation or not? Do they impact release to the environment, or is there a risk posed to the environment from them? And is there a risk of off-site release? And so those three factors were the prioritization criteria per se, but it was more of a judgmental based on those three factors. If you tripped all three of those triggers, potentially, those were the ones that were elevated to the highest priority. If you tripped one or two of them, they might be lower. So, so for all these facilities, we looked at that list of criteria for them.
We also involved our ORSSAB, our science and NNSA partners. And so in what they thought were the facilities that were in their way, either for modernization of the lab or modernization of the Y-12 facilities. So for instance, 3026, which is right downtown ORNL, was very important to the laboratory to get the runoff, the contaminated runoff that was coming off of that dealt with, because that's right downtown ORNL. So that also entered into what we prioritized as the first items we went and did.
And one other thing that was used as well was a knowledge of or understanding of, if we don't do any work, does it make our life more difficult and expensive in the future? From a practical standpoint, you want to try to take care, for example, the water that contributes to mold issues in the future, and the rotting of the wood and so forth. So if those kinds of hazards were present as well, that makes our life much more difficult in the D&D phase, that receives some consideration in the prioritization as well.
I guess the only other factor that I would point out is because we don't know year to year, since this was a plus up from Congress, whether the funding would be available. The other piece of it was to do pieces of work that we could get done within the funding, so that you had off-ramps. You did not want to take all $28 million that we got and start a $50,000 project or a $50 million project, get done, and then in 17 not get additional funding, and now what do you do? So that's why you'll see for most of these, they're very discrete scopes of work that we could get done for the funding we got. And the idea was that if you had a cost savings, because it's all based on an estimate, right? You don't know exactly what it's going to cost until you do the work. If there was cost savings, there's down the prioritization scheme, there's additional work we would go after if we had that cost savings. But what it looks like now is most of that work will carry into 17. And then we hope to get additional funding in 17 to push forward, and there's some additional work we will start with additional funding.
Okay, thank you. Does that answer your question? Yeah. All right, good. Phil?
Thank you. The 2008 decision to call this a critical decision one was a $9 to $14 billion number and 25-year duration. I'm sure that's a tough number to ask about, but what do you guess the 9 to 14 has become, and the 25-year duration?
Yep. We've done some analysis of that. If I can remember what the number is, I didn't anticipate this question. But some of the work that was actually in that 9 to 14 has been done through Recovery Act work. Some of the work that's in what was that capital project was actually operating dollars that gets adjusted out. And then you got what's left for the D&D, which is the capital project scope. I believe
5 to 9.
I'm saying it's less than the 9 to 14 now. Is it 5 to 9?
Yeah, right now it's roughly 5 to 9 billion. And part of that's the work that we pulled out, the work that was done under ARA, because IFDP also allowed us to go after the American Recovery and whatever.
Reinvestment.
Thank you. Reinvestment Act. I couldn't remember what ARRA stood for. Allowed us to do that. In IFDP, we also had looked at doing some additional construction of new facilities. Because at the time, back in 07, 08 timeframe, there was a thought process that we would replace the liquid and gaseous waste operations over at ORNL with a new plant. And instead, Office of Science has elected to go a different direction now, which is to reduce their emissions that go into our system for treatment, and to go with point source treatment where they could. So instead of having an integrated system, they'll do point source treatment. So that means that that major project, which was a large capital outlay, goes away. Then we're also going to do something similar. We would replace our transuranic waste processing center with a new center that would support REDC and the HIFER reactor. And instead, the Office of Science has elected to go with a different approach for that. So those two facilities were pulled out as well, and those represented very expensive capital costs. So that's one of the reasons for the reduction.
Okay, thank you. And Rudy?
Yes, thank you. Two questions, sir, if I may. In regards to 3026 and the water in the tunnel, do we know if any of that has leaked out? And if so, do you anticipate some sort of a plume emanating from that tunnel?
We know that 3026 is in an area where there's some contamination plumes from past operations. As for the source of water, I don't know if it's in leakage from the ground, similar to what's at 7,500, we think,
Okay.
or whether it's the rainfall through the hot cell that's contaminated. So the samples will help us tell that, as well as the observations on whether we have in leakage. So we don't really know the exact science of the water flow in or out of that tunnel area. But we do know it's within an area of contamination plume.
Second question, if I may. You had indicated that the HRE pond was remediated in the 90s. Did you mean the stabilization of the pond or the actual remediation of the pond?
There was a pond located out there where they flushed water from the reactor operation. It was actually remediated and capped.
Correct.
Yeah,
And that has
I believe it was
subsequently
grouted,
been
actually.
removed?
yeah.
That's subsequently been removed in the early 2000 timeframe as
Yeah, I
part
don't
of the...
remember the years. but-
Right,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that pond is actually gone now? Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, Bill, thank you. One question, 7,500, the combustible material, was that contaminated?
It was low-level waste, yeah.
And where did you dispose of it?
It went out to Nevada, to the Nevada National Security Site.
Okay, and I have one question, which is, what do you mean by, and this was on slide 20, materials were de-inventoried in the 1990s? What does de-inventory mean?
Slide 20, is that the 30, 28, 29?
Yes.
That means.
I'll answer that.
Okay,
It's government,
Why,
it's
might he get it
government
wrong?
speak for removed.
Okay.
yeah.
It's that
Taken out of the
simple.
hot cells.
Okay.
But it sounds a lot more scientific when we say de-inventory.
Thank you. All right. More questions. Elizabeth?
For the roofing materials that are being replaced, are you testing those materials prior to installation to ensure that you're not putting asbestos back in the building to increase abatement costs later?
Our plan is to take the asbestos out and not replace it. The building is, we're planning for the goal of the overall work that we're doing in 7,500 is to put it in what we call a cold and dark standby, which basically allows us to cut the power off and turn the lights off and stay out of it until it goes to D&D. So there won't be a need for insulation of the piping and so forth that's in there.
No, I'm talking about the roofing materials.
Oh, the roofing
So
material.
are you testing the roofing materials that are being reinstalled for the roof replacements to ensure that they don't have asbestos?
We're not doing roofing at Ornell. I know the White 12 is.
Wasn't there a building that you talked about roof replacement
Oh, we
on?
put a seal over the building 3026 hot cell bank.
Mm-hmm.
It's a polyethylene or polyurethane liner, plastic liner
Okay,
that we just coated that top with.
thank you.
Okay, thank you. It looks like Dave has put his tent back up.
I just had a comment about asbestos. Having been involved in school construction all my life, since the asbestos uproar back in the 80s, there are no more asbestos-containing building materials being produced in the United States. So whatever problems you have with the roof, they will not be containing asbestos materials, nor do pipe insulations or anything like that.
So I'm not going to debate that, but I'm a licensed asbestos inspector in 4 states and a project designer and a management planner and have 20 years experience. And there actually are widely sold asbestos-containing building materials in the United States, and they're installed routinely. And in a lot of the projects that I work on, people will do abatement-type projects and then unknowingly put back asbestos-containing materials. And unfortunately, the cost of abatement is only going to continue to go up, and that's why I was asking. So that's a misconception that there you can no longer get asbestos-containing materials, but you can go to any building supply store or supplier in the country and buy those materials.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Let's see, do we have any questions from the public on the ORNL sites? Looks like, yes, no? All right, go ahead. State your name and then
Thank you, Melinda.
you can take the microphone up if you like.
I can lean, it might be easier. Tim Griffin with the TIBA. Bill, thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
This might actually be a question, I don't know, Jay, for you. Bill, you made reference to the report that the Excess Contaminated Facilities Working Group is preparing. Any sense of when that might actually be finalized? And the second part of that question is, once it is out, is there enough information and detail in there that that report will probably serve as a basis for budget projections and so forth for dealing with these facilities?
Well, the first one, I guess, is easy or hard to answer, right? But because the real answer is no. I don't know if it'll get out or not. The life of those reports, especially when it has multiple program offices involved like this one, which has not only NNSA, EM, science, but believe it or not, has NE involvement as well. So you have four program offices that all have their input into it. Then it goes through a review with the Congressional Affairs Office, General Counsel, and right now it's going back and forth a couple times between DOE and OMB. And so other reports in the past have never made it out of OMB. Right now it's with OMB, and it may or may not get released to Congress. With regard to budget projections, yes, it has budget projections and life cycles within the report, or at least the last version of the report I had seen. So, yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to give, at least, I know we have at least one person on the phone, so Connie, or if there's anyone else on the phone, if there are any questions from you all.
Yes, this is Connie Jones. I don't know who that was speaking about the release of the report, but from an EPA perspective, since there's enough detail in those reports, do you think that could be used to project milestones for implementing these projects under the FSA?
Absolutely not. The report would not have enough detail at that level. It'll be high level. This is how much we think we would spend a year as a department on excess facilities, because the funding doesn't just come to EM. Some of these facilities, in fact, the majority of these facilities right now at Y12, for instance, are not owned by EM. They're science facilities, NE facilities, and NNSA facilities that we're spending money on. And in fact, NNSA within their budget this year got more funding to deal with the excess facility issue than EM did. So what you will get out of that report are very high-level numbers that are at a congressional budget level or a departmental budget level, not at a budget development level like you're thinking, like we would have for Oak Ridge, where you have individual projects.
Okay, a follow-up, and maybe you answered the question for me already, but I know it may be high level, but there should be some framework from what Oak Ridge may have presented, that you may be able to utilize that as a foundation for building, depending upon the budget that you get.
Right. What went into our input into that is the budget that you got, our budget projections you have seen. So our plan for Oak Ridge that we have shared with EPA year after year, while it does get adjusted, that plan was the basis for the numbers Oak Ridge EM provided to headquarters. All I'm telling you is every site did that, and when it gets to a 20-page report with maybe 40 pages of backup material, at that level, you're not going to see the detail for setting milestones. You'll have to get back down to the budget level that we use when we build the budget for our plan that shows individual projects over a 20 or 30-year period.
Okay, so was the DPM model used to help develop that?
Yes.
And see, you probably, Jeff and the others may know about that than I do, so I'm just
Yes.
asking the question as a novice.
Yes, our dynamic planning model was the basis for the input that EM provided.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I think we've exhausted questions for Bill, so Brian, your turn. Yeah.
I don't.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, as Jay was mentioning, in Oak Ridge, we're a multi-program site. So you heard Jay talk about all the different programs, including nuclear energy. And so the nuclear energy building is actually right there. That's Beta 3. That will be eventually part of the Manhattan Park. We also have the National Nuclear Security Administration, who basically is the landlord for Y-12 and owns most of the buildings out there. You heard him mention the Office of Science buildings, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. And that's the biology complex and one little building over here. So EM, out of all these large buildings, we actually currently own Alpha 4, which is right here. The worst of the worst that Bill mentioned, which is Alpha 5, is right here. And as Jay mentioned, NNSA also got a plus up for excess facilities, and a lot of their monies went into roof repair and putting new roofs on some of their worst buildings, including the worst of the worst. So they put a new roof on this one, Beta 4, I believe they did 9206, and working on some of the others. So working out at Y-12, as I'll also talk about in a little bit, can be challenging. It is a highly secure site, and there are multiple programs involved, so it involves a lot of coordination among programs. Oh, wrong way. All right. So Jay also talked about the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, and we were fortunate enough that the biology complex buildings the biology complex did involve a lot more buildings. These are the two largest that remain. There's about 350,000 square feet. Most of that is in these two buildings. It talks about 4 of 12 buildings. Really, a lot of those, 6 of those buildings are really small. This is one of the 8. There's a little building here, and the others are little additions to this building. So really, when we're talking about the biology complex, we're really talking about primarily 9207 and 9210 with some ancillary facilities. And these buildings have been inactive for more than a decade. You also heard Bill talk about that most of these facilities were constructed back in the 1940s. They've been out there for about 70 years, and throughout their life cycles, they've served many purposes. A lot of you may be familiar with the biology complex, and you probably have heard the term mouse house. So they did some biological experiments in this complex. But prior to that, these buildings were also used in uranium recovery, salvage, and other operations before they were turned over for research. And we're actually fortunate in that before they were deactivated, science actually did a pretty good job of going into those buildings and cleaning out most of the loose materials and stuff. We're a little bit unlucky in that they've been sitting there for a long time, deactivated, and what we've learned over the years is water infiltration is not our friend. And you can see through these pictures, we also have degradation of the exteriors, but this is a prime example of what happens when you have cold and dark facilities and where you have water infiltration. You can't see this real well, but those are starting to rust. And you can see, materials that are falling. Some of those are asbestos materials that are falling, so it creates a significant hazard. So Bill also talked about risk reduction. And for these buildings, one of the risks we're trying to reduce by going in there now is risk to the workers, because it's pretty challenging to go in and do work in these facilities today. Imagine if they sit for another 5 or 10 years cold and dark, then it's going to be even worse. And the risk that we're addressing is life cycle risk and life cycle cost risk. As you can see by these pictures, to go into these buildings now, the workers have to wear respirators and dress out fully because of the airborne risk. Part of that is the asbestos that's degrading. Part of it is when you have buildings that sit there for a long time, windows get broken, you start getting animals inside the facilities. So, there are a lot of birds that have been in and out, bird droppings, which also can create a hazard, mold. So those are probably the primary reasons for the respirator. So one of the first things we had to do was set up a station for a clean room for all the workers to go in, to get dressed, to be able to enter the facility, and then when they're coming out, to remove all of the PPE, personal protective equipment. So what we've been doing in the biology complex is, before we can demolish a building, we have to go in and do characterization. So we've been doing sample markings and some surveying, and we're actually right now doing characterization. The characterization effort serves a couple purposes. Part of it is we have to know, when we're looking at the building, what type of contaminants we have, so that we can make decisions on what the appropriate place for the waste to go. Does it, can it go to the sanitary landfills, which is our first on our waste hierarchy? Are there some contaminants that drive it into our low-level mixed waste facility, EMWMF, the Environmental Management Waste Management Facility? And then even at times there are some waste streams that have to go off-site. The other part of the characterization is, before we can go in and do demolition on a building, there are some waste streams that we have to remove. So there might be hot spots. There are some things called universal waste that have to be removed because those can't go to a landfill. So part of the characterization is determining the full extent of the contamination and to inform what we need to go in and remove before we can just knock the building down and then dispose of it. So we're doing work in that facility. That's one of the major efforts at Y12. So one of the other major efforts, I pointed out that the Oak Ridge Office of Environmental Management actually owns one of the facilities at Y12. It's called Alpha 4. So we have actually, I believe, done a fairly good job of maintaining the roof at Alpha 4. But as it continues to sit, we continually have to go in and do roof repairs. So one of the big efforts with the excess facilities money was to go into Alpha 4 and do additional roof repairs. And that should put us in pretty good shape for the next 5 to 10 years for that facility. So the contractor mobilized around mid-August, and we actually finished up that roof repair in mid-October. So also at Alpha 4, Alpha 4 was used, one of its uses was for lithium separation, and so there was a lot of equipment on the outside of the building, and for those of you familiar with lithium separation, that process used a lot of mercury. So what you're looking at outside of Alpha 4 is a lot of the equipment that was used for the mercury feed into that process. And so that equipment has been sitting outdoors for decades. It's starting to rust and degrade, and there's still some mercury holdup in some of this equipment. So before we let that equipment degrade to the point that we are having a spread of contamination, where equipment rusts through and mercury potentially leaks out, we're going in, we're doing the characterization of that equipment. That will help us determine waste disposition pathways, and then we'll go in and actually remove all of this equipment. So working at Y-12, as I mentioned, has a lot of challenges. For those of you that are familiar with Y-12, it is a high security location, so there's a lot of security challenges. And when we're working with mercury, you have challenges to worker protection. We also want to make sure that we're prepared to ensure we're not spreading contamination. So there'll be a lot of work that goes in to sealing a lot of these pads and taking the necessary steps where if we did have a spill, which we're taking steps to prevent against, that it's contained and we're able to clean that up. And the other thing, this is the case at ORNL, in addition to Y-12, we have very important national missions going on right in the vicinity of these degrading facilities. So we have to try to do our cleanup work so that we're not disrupting those missions. So that's one of the other challenges. So after we get through with the West Colex, there are other process equipment. There's some on the south. The equipment on the south is not near as much as we have on the west side, and we also have equipment on the east side, which is these bigger tanks. This is the equipment on the south. So we'll also go in, depending on funding availability, as Jay mentioned, we have more projects in the pipeline than we have funding, so we've prioritized those and we'll tackle them as we have funds available. So we think in 2017 we'll finish the removal of the equipment on the west side. We should be able to characterize the east and the south sides, and then depending on how much money we get in 2017, we may actually be able to do some removal on the east and south sides. And that is all of the work that we currently have going on for excess facilities at Y-12. So hopefully Bill answered all your questions. But if not, I'm free to take questions.
Okay, questions, anyone? Oh, come on, don't let him get off that easily. Go ahead, Chris.
How much of this waste that you're removing from these excess facilities will be disposed of locally? Do you have any idea?
Well, that's a good question, because I actually meant to talk about that when I was talking about the equipment from the west side of Alpha 4. Right now, with the excess facility work, other than PPE, that's really the only waste that's going to be generated. And because that has mercury, hazardous mercury associated with it, that waste will go off-site for treatment and disposal. Now, there will be some minor amounts of waste that is generated that doesn't have, that only has very minor amounts of mercury that's not hazardous, that can go to either the on-site land disposal facility or the EMWMF. And when I'm talking about minor amounts, it's, we can detect mercury down to very low levels, but there may be just a little bit here or there, but not enough to get into where it's actually hazardous. So they'll check that, and that's the importance of the characterization. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other board members have any questions? You did such a wonderful job, Brian, you see. Now you're going to have to let Bill know that you did a better job than he did.
Well, thank you.
Do we have any questions from members of the public?
Come on, Roger.
Okay. It doesn't look like it. How about on the phone? No. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Appreciate both presentations.